This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
Somebody who's going to college who wants a good job, if they feel like and get the signals from employers that they need the degree, they're going to do that. I just don't know how long that's going to hold, given what we're talking about here with college grads doing work that they didn't need a degree for. Like, how long is that credentialing necessity going to stick?
For close observers of higher education, something troubling is in the air. The Trump administration, which about a year ago began its pressure campaign against high-profile research universities, has largely turned its attention elsewhere. The war in Iran, gas prices, and even the Epstein files have taken center stage. All of that could change on a dime. For the moment, though, people who care about colleges and universities are catching their collective breath. So, what are academics doing with this fleeting reprieve? Worrying, of course. The higher education discourse is riddled today with concerns about issues that predate Trump's second term or that have been laid bare by his volatile presidency. Today on the show, I'll talk with my colleague Andy Thomason, assistant managing editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, about the uneasy feeling that's permeating the world we cover. Andy, welcome back to College Matters.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about what I'm feeling. I'm feeling a great disturbance in the force. Something is going on here. Have you felt this?
Jack, do you watch Survivor?
I do now. I did not used to, but within the last 12 months or so, my wife and son have completely converted me, and I'm all dialed in.
Well, since you're a new convert, you might not know that in old Survivor, in the old days, after the 39 days were almost up, the remaining survivors, the remaining castaways on the island, were presented with a mirror where they could look at how much they'd changed over the course of all the backstabbing and the cheating and the voting people out and the weathering of the elements. And then they would look at themselves in the mirror and they would see how much they'd changed. They'd see their scars and the bumps and the bruises, but also they just get a good look at themselves for the first time in a while. That to me is a little bit like what's happening today with higher education. After the frenzied first assault of the Trump administration, after the dust from that has cleared somewhat, the sector's taking a hard look at itself in the mirror.
Yeah, nothing more terrifying than looking at yourself. I think of this every morning.
It's so true. I'm looking at myself now, and I don't like what I see in the Zoom screen.
Yeah, I felt this when The New Yorker put out its sort of big sweeping piece in March about higher education. So I'm sure you read this. This was Nick Lemon's piece. It's called The Unmaking of the American University. And he starts in a way that I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on this. He starts by talking about the atom bomb and the building of the atomic bomb and all of the minds that came together, Oppenheimer et al., to do this, and then the creation of the modern research university to some degree out of that. The United States was exceptional, and scientists were going to come together and do great things, and the federal government was going to fund this. And it struck me that this is like the 500th re-encapsulation I've read in the last year about the atomic bomb and how it relates to research universities. It's almost like the boilerplate nut graph of 2025 was about Oppenheimer. And I just wonder what you think about that. Like, why are we obsessing over this creation myth of the research university right now?
Well, it's because, Jack, it's such a grand story. A bunch of people getting together, like we saw in the movie Oppenheimer, to invent the most powerful, destructive tool that has ever been created. And then to have this kind of epilogue to that story that's like, this thing spawned the golden age, right? I mean, it has a certain contradiction to it that's sort of appetizing in a way.
Yeah.
And it's very just attractive as a piece of drama. But, you know, there's also a lot of truth to it. And we get into this in the Lemon piece, which is that mammoth investment did lay the groundwork for what we've all in higher ed experienced for the last several decades. So there's some truth to it. It makes sense as a creation myth.
I'd wonder, too, whether it speaks to, I started this by saying I felt a disturbance in the force, and then you mixed metaphors to Survivor and ruined that setup.
I know.
But,
we're going to have to retake the whole thing. I know.
but in any case, I do think that people return to creation myths when they feel untethered. And that's kind of what I'm vibing with right now, that there's a sense that higher education just feels super uneasy. And it's this moment sort of where they're catching their collective breath. Trump is still sort of out there as a menacing force, but isn't up in their business right now, or at least hasn't been for the last couple of weeks.
Jack, before you go further, I just want to add that I agree with that idea that there is something comforting about the familiar tale. It does remind a little bit of the pandemic, doesn't it? Where we began to rediscover ancient practices like baking bread or reading the Bible, you know? It's like,
That's right. Yeah, and people want to go back and think about how it all began. But Lemon's piece draws its power, I think, from its scope. He gives sort of a mini history of higher education. He talks about the late 19th century when a lot of university leaders in the United States were wanting to emulate the German research university, the creation of the NSF in the 1950s, which was a big boon for higher education, of course, the GI Bill. But what I zeroed in on was, where do these cracks begin? Where do the cracks in public confidence that are haunting higher education today really start? And I feel like his piece starts in a place that a lot of these do, which is going back to the Berkeley free speech movement. So it's late 1964. Mario Savio gives his famous Bodies Upon the Gears speech in the middle of this conflict. Just to set the mood, let's hear a little bit of that.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
So that still slaps, obviously, and I listen to it before my morning workouts every
before
day.
Your CrossFit,
but
during your CrossFit.
Exactly. Nothing gets me motivated like the Bodies Upon the Gears speech. But it freaked people out in 1964. Defense contractors and housewives of Orange County were wondering what the hell was going on up there, and this gave an opening for a young, promising actor turned politician named Ronald Reagan to have something to run against as governor of California. And it really sets the stage for Reagan's election and then the dismissal of Clark Kerr as the University of California's president. Reagan had run on this idea that Kerr had, allowed the inmates to run the asylum, and this was turning into a hippy-dippy place that needed to be reined in. And I was looking back, Andy, even at some of our own coverage of this period, from, I think, 1967, our own coverage. It's after Clark Kerr gets forced out. Most people think that Ronald Reagan had a lot to do with that. I'll read to you just a piece from this. On the university's 9 campuses, the news spread fast. Faculty members, some of them summoned from classrooms by their colleagues, gathered in halls and offices to discuss its significance. Secretaries clustered in shocked groups. At Berkeley, faculty groups issued protest. One statement signed by 81 faculty members said the firing showed, quote, political influence over the university. And this was a huge shock to the point, Andy, that secretaries were clustered in shocked groups, as the Chronicle reported. And what this New Yorker piece does is it pivots from that to talk about all of the other things that happened thereafter, Nixon declaring the professors the enemy, and then even the Obama era of Title IX, where the Title IX apparatus is used by the federal government to rein in sexual assaults on these campuses, threats of funding cuts. This is another way that higher education is sort of coming under the heel of the feds, although it feels very different because I think there's some common values at play there. And then, of course, the rise of Turning Point USA in the 2010s with Charlie Kirk, until we get to 2023 with those memorable congressional hearings on anti-Semitism, which led to the presidents of Penn and Harvard to resign. What I took from all of that, reading it all there together, written obviously beautifully, was that there has been a relationship between the feds and higher education over 80 years or so, and that relationship has been deteriorating particularly among conservatives in this country over that period of time since like the late 60s. And today it's really well beyond conservatives. It's most of the country that has misgivings about higher education for a lot of reasons. And I think maybe that's where the anxiety is coming from, is there's a sense that this is no longer sort of a fringe critique coming from far right-wing quarters, but it feels much more mainstream, the critique. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Jack. Let me rephrase it slightly to say that it's quite possible that it was broad public support that insulated the sector from the criticisms that people like Ronald Reagan made about the professors being the enemy, and we need to rein in these crazy people in the ivory tower. Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, higher education was by and large affordable, public higher education especially.
Yeah.
The scientific inventions were, of course, happening as they continue to be today, but it's outside dispute that I think there was broader support for the sector then. And we've seen that slide and slide and slide and slide in polls since. So I think that goes away toward explaining why the attacks and the incursions on autonomy are gaining some purchase.
Anytime higher education seems like it can't keep its own house in order, people seem like they're cool with some federal intervention.
Yeah, and I'm glad that when you were describing some of the Lemon article, you brought up the anti-Semitism hearings in that House committee. And
this is Elise Stefanik's big takedown of these college presidents, a very memorable moment.
That's right, in which two of those presidents later were pushed out. Friend of the pod, Holden Thorpe, is quoted in the article at that point saying...
This is the former chancellor of University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
He's quoted in the article as saying, like, this is the moment I knew we weren't going to be able to explain this away, that a big backlash was coming, that the display of those presents was so out of touch with what people demanded from that moment that it was going to cause a huge political reckoning that would shake the entire sector.
Yeah. But I do think that at the end of the day, while those things matter, and God bless Holden Thorpe, bless his heart.
Has he been on the pod?
Has he been on the
pod?
He hasn't, okay. But obviously a friend of the pod and a friend of the Chronicle.
A friend in spirit, yeah.
But I would say that it's always the economy, stupid. And the reason that I'm feeling this uneasiness has a lot to do with a weird thing that only I'm reading and a few other people, which is Bob Shireman's Substack. So Bob Shireman, maybe it's more popular than I know. He's a big college affordability advocate. And he had a really interesting Substack article within the last few weeks that was basically sharing some data on college and earnings. And the subtitle was "A Plea for Less Bullishness from Higher Ed Leaders." So Shireman is saying, look, college leaders have been saying for decades that borrowing money for college is a good investment. And I remember having meetings back in, 2008, 2010 with college presidents who had all gotten the same talking points, which was, well, think about how much money you'd borrow for a car. And a car is a depreciating asset, whereas a college education is the gift that keeps on giving. Like, it's ridiculous that people are getting so bent out of shape about borrowing tens of thousands of dollars for an education that'll last a lifetime, but they're perfectly willing to borrow $20,000, $30,000 to buy a car. Shireman is saying that that calculation is actually changing. He said borrowing a car means you have a car. In other words, you get to drive it while you're borrowing. You can leave college, though, without a degree or a metaphorical car in this case, in which case it was a terrible investment. If you look at working adults, there's people making six figures in this country who don't have college degrees. This is actually more than I thought from looking at Shireman's data. They have some college or only high school, and they're making good money. We can link to the details in the show notes, but the bottom line is lots of people are earning the same amount of money with a degree as they would have without, and some are earning less. And this news is getting worse on that front. The New York Times has a piece just this week about the job market just being crap for college grads right now. And so I think that we can have all these debates about the culture wars and, the Chris Rufo of it all and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, this is a pocketbook issue for a lot of American families. And I think that's not unlike politicians. That's where the support just drops out. And I think that everybody knows that once that dynamic starts to change, the idea that college is the ticket to the middle or upper middle class, once that calculation changes, the support erodes, all of the fancy talk about the great things you can get from education start to fall away.
Yeah, Jack, I think that college leaders and people in higher ed may have gotten a little bit too comfortable with their selling point of the power of the degree. In that piece by Sharman, one of the things that he takes issue with is one of the associations will say, like, a typical college grad, makes X amount of money more than somebody who just has the high school education. And typical is a bit of a loaded word in that context, right? When you hear
it's typical, an alluring term.
An alluring term, you might say. You hear it and you think, well, that's me. I'm typical, right? And so it does whitewash the image of the people who we know exist. There are many of them who do some college, no degree. And that turns out to be a mistake in a lot of those cases. They don't get that economic impact. I'm glad that you brought up the story from the New York Times this week, Jack, that shows that the unemployment rate for new college grads is the worst that it's been in over 10 years if you exclude the pandemic. That's very concerning for the here and now, right? And this conversation is about the introspection that colleges are having right now, and that is a now problem.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. If you're trying to keep up with new academic books, you already know the problem. There's more coming out than anyone can possibly read. That's why New Books Network is the best resource for scholars and deep readers to keep up with new research and writing in their field. New Books Network is a massive collection of long-form interviews with scholars and authors, almost 30,000 conversations on the site across history, politics, literature, science, you name it. You'll hear directly from the authors who lay out their arguments and research methods. New Books Network also works closely with academic publishers, including partnerships with Princeton University Press, Oxford University Press, and MIT Press. So it's a great way to stay current with the kinds of books that shape actual conversations in higher ed. If you want a smart, efficient way to discover books worth taking seriously, go to newbooksnetwork.com. That's newbooksnetwork.com. Nobody covers international higher education like my colleague Karen Fisher. And now you get Karen's best reporting and most thoughtful analysis delivered directly to your inbox with her newsletter, Latitudes. Latitudes examines the economic, cultural, and political divides that shape and drive higher education's global relationships and reach. From study abroad programs to the effects of geopolitics on colleges, Karen covers it all. Sign up for free at chronicle.com/getnewsletters. The thing that always frustrated me about this conversation, Andy, was I was in rooms with a bunch of college presidents who were talking about this as a problem, or cost control advocates like Bob Shireman, and I'm thinking, you're all sending your kids to college. This is an academic argument for you. You believe in this. But of course they do. They're middle class and upper middle class people for whom this works out. The problem is for the social mobility set, the promise that education puts you in a different tier economically. And that's where this is starting to break down. I do think that one of the disconnects that always happens, though, is that people draw a lot from their own personal experience and anecdotes, even smart people. And so you have a room full of people who are looking at what all the data are screaming, which is, it's getting harder to make this justification, but at the same time, in their own lived experience and their children and their cousins, etc., they've seen college education work out. And I think that's always been a disconnect among policymakers.
Oh, yeah. And the temptation for wishful thinking is so immense in any profession, but especially one that's confronted with the kind of landscape that higher ed has been confronted with. And speaking of which, I want to shift a little bit into some future-focused stuff here, because that New York Times story we were talking about, it alludes to the fact that, people are worried about AI. What is AI going to do to the workplace? Right. And there's not a lot of evidence right now, the article notes, that AI is what's responsible for this poor unemployment rate for new college grads, but people are worried. And Jack, I'm getting some disturbing deja vu And I want to get your take on it.
Okay.
You and I think, are both newspaper men at heart. Am I correct?
Sure.
That industry, the newspaper industry, was based on the fact that the cheapest, most consumer-friendly way to let people know what was happening in the world that day was the broadsheet newspaper. It was paper. And that basic fact sustained and created a thriving industry of newspapers that was a proud industry, developed its own culture, its own awards, its own code of ethics, until a new, cheapest, most consumer-friendly technology was invented. The smartphone combined with social media and the internet. It's the devil's threesome, I like to call it.
Yeah.
And that new technology resulted in a vast contraction of this industry, the newspaper industry. We've watched as institutions have had to close, it's become a lot smaller. And the deja vu I'm getting, Jack, is that a new technology has recently been invented that is cheap and consumer friendly and can teach you advanced concepts. Not as well as a person can, but that can give you the gist. And this is not a perfect analogy by any means, but I am seeing some of the same disbelief and derision and bargaining about AI that I can remember so vividly from the days in which people that I knew in the news industry would react to threats from social media and these new inventions. It's all ringing very familiar to me. And that gives me pause as we look to the future of higher education.
No, and it reminds me too, Andy, of my own failures of imagination around this. Because I remember being asked, I know this was when I was working at the Gainesville Sun, so we're talking 2006, something like that. And I remember being asked by somebody at the University of Florida, like, do you think people are going to have paper newspapers in 30 years? And I'm like, well, I think people will always want something to hold. I really couldn't conceptualize where we were now. I mean, we're in an environment now where, for the most part, I'd rather read a book on my tablet than carry around a book of varied size and weight in my backpack. I just never really thought about it that way. So I'm wondering if I'm experiencing the same thing when it comes to college, because I can't conceptualize of a world in which we move past credentialing, a world in which we move past, like, these are figures of respect and authority that are conferring upon you a badge that says you are allowed to go out into society and work in a smart place. And I think that you're right, that I think in 10 years, even 5 years, I may be coming back and realizing the limits of my own imagination around that.
First, I want to caution that the analogy is not perfect. News consumers, when they were introduced to social media, could vote with their feet and be like, oh yeah, I'm not subscribing to the Gainesville Sun anymore. I'm content with the gist that I get from all these feeds, right?
Right.
Somebody who's going to college who wants a good job, if they feel like and get the signals from employers that they need the degree, they're going to do that. I just don't know how long that's going to hold, given what we're talking about here with college grads doing work that they didn't need a degree for. Like, how long is that credentialing necessity going to stick?
Well, it's also about curation too, that colleges engage in curation around the knowledge that matters. Go on ChatGPT and ask it a question, and it's remarkable that it can keep answering it. But now I can't get back to, like, wait, what was the rice and beans recipe that this started with, and how am I talking about Hitler now? Like,
that says more about you than the technology, I think, Jack.
Yeah,
it's a big. Speaking of mirrors,
fair enough, fair enough. But I do think this is starting to hit institutions where it hurts, because part of what happens is, I think the canary in the coal mine, Andy, is always these public regionals, places that aren't huge brand names in the country. And I haven't done a rigorous analysis of where these layoffs are happening, but I was just looking over just like the past couple of weeks. There are program closures and layoffs from, you name it, not only a wealthy place like Princeton, but also the University of North Texas and the University of Maine. These are places that are really out there fighting the good fight, and they're struggling. They are feeling this pinch that's happening. And again, I think that's what the low-level hum of anxiety is about. At the end of the day, it goes back to the economy. how secure do people feel in academic jobs right now? They don't feel very secure at all. We're writing a lot about people who can't teach things they want to teach in classes because of onerous new laws around DEI, et cetera. But the more lived experience for most professors in this country right now is absolutely crapping bricks that your college is going to run out of money.
The contraction is real. I mean, higher ed has essentially for the last year been in a recession, and we don't see that recognized as much in news unless you're reading the Chronicle or listening to College Matters. And that's because it's sort of industry specific, right? The chill that was cast from the White House this time last year touched off a sudden spirit of conservatism in the budgets or a panic based on what do our next few years look like. And some colleges, some elite colleges, some of the decisions they made in the last couple of years looked poor. Some colleges were struck by declining international students. Some colleges faced declines in research funding, right? Or state funding. It's a collision of forces. And it reminds me, Jack, of the conclusion that Nicholas Lemon makes in his article that we've been referencing in the New Yorker piece. He concludes that the age of autonomy for universities is likely over, and that autonomy is not going to return. This, to me, connects to something we've seen just recently. All of these program closures, degrees being shuttered, many of them are those same degrees that were born in the late 60s. When colleges were pressed to start gender studies or ethnic studies departments. These, on some campuses, are some of the first programs to be shuttered, either as a result of political influence or through just the cutting of budgets. And that, to me, at the high level, is a signal that that autonomy is going away.
You think explain that to me, Andy. Because they're cutting programs that were fashionable in the 60s, you think that that's a sign of loss of autonomy?
Those programs are symbolic of the academy's ability to govern itself in terms of what it offers, right? They have a powerful symbolism. And not just those, but also if we think about disciplines like sociology. We just ran a story about the way that the curriculum of sociology is quite literally being rewritten as a result of state legislation in the state of Florida. That, again, carries potent symbolism of a state government that is taking the reins away from the people who determine what is being taught in classrooms.
Yeah, I think that there's a weird national messaging happening, which is we can't trust you, we can't afford you, we're not sure you're necessary, and there might even be too many of you. That was Vivek Ramaswamy, who's the gubernatorial candidate in Ohio, made some news recently saying, I love universities in Ohio. I want us to have the best universities, but we have too many of them. And there's been some caveats that were given to that statement afterward, I think. But at the end of the day, this is somebody running for governor in a, what used to be sort of a swing state saying, let's get rid of some of these universities. That's the sort of reputational deficit that these institutions have right now, which is just questioning their very need to exist.
And we're seeing consolidation in other states. It's not a crazy concept anymore. You're seeing some state systems combined campuses, combined resource sharing, and all of this. But I think that reflects that is still very much a third rail, especially at the local level. A town that's close to a regional public is going to protest quite vigorously if a candidate for governor, somebody who wants to win the public trust, is going to say, we're going to shut down this engine.
That's why it always goes back to economics, the idea of cutting the NIH massively. These Congress people hear from their constituents and say, we're going to lose jobs. This is going to sink our local economy. And all of a sudden, the politically fashionable thing becomes untenable because real people start to lose money, and that becomes the issue. We started this conversation by talking about the Trump administration being a little bit preoccupied. I don't want to overstate that because it's, early in the morning when we're recording this and something could happen in the next 5 minutes. But right now, it does feel like a little bit of a lull. We haven't been issued a new compact for higher education like came out a few months ago that the Trump administration floated. There haven't been huge developments in some of these ongoing legal battles between Trump and the Ivy League.
Well, Trump did sue Harvard twice yesterday, but I agree with you that That's all right. This week.
Forgive me for feeling like that is an incremental development in an ongoing story. Trump sued Harvard yesterday. When did that not happen? But the idea that there are bigger fish to fry right now, that the war in Iran in particular is consuming a lot of the White House focus. I wonder what you think about that and how that relates to this larger story of like higher ed's feeling of unease.
Well, Jack, I think it's very related. But first of all, in my haste to make you look like an idiot, I incorrectly said that the government had sued Harvard twice this week. They actually just started 2 new investigations. Now, that news came a few days after they did sue Harvard. It's really just a lot to keep up with.
Well, Mr. Smarty Pants has issued a clarification, I see.
Not my first, not my last. But to your question about these bigger problems occupying the White House, it's made me think very big picture. In a lot of ways, the success of American higher education has been downstream of the success of America. And America has been the global hegemonic power for a long time. That dominant position has laid the groundwork for a staggering successful system of higher education, both public and private here in America. And when we look around today, we see an unpopular war that seems to be having mixed success. We see concerning economic signals. We see geopolitical alliances fragmenting and forming in new places. This is scary stuff for people in America because it undermines this very comforting sense of stability that we've derived from all of the stories that came out of World War II, much of it about the sparkling system of higher education. So it's really been making me think big picture like that.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I have been thinking about the scope of history as well, because I was just reading Chuck Klosterman's book, The 90s. It's a great book. He's a smart guy, and I'm a Gen X guy, so it was interesting to me to revisit this period in history and think about what the 90s felt like. But he said something in here that really struck me in connection with this conversation. Let me see if I can find it in here. It was, in retrospect, a remarkably easy time to be alive. There were still nuclear weapons, but there was not going to be a nuclear war. The internet was coming, but reluctantly, and there was no reason to believe it would be anything but awesome. And what Klosterman starts to talk about is that the 90s were a period of time in which you kind of had a choice as to whether to be a politically active person, that this was something you could opt into or opt out of. And I think that we're in such a different age now where political activism or political consciousness, let me just say that, is not optional. That everybody feels like their lives are being very overtly shaped by the political context of the country in a way that, might have applied to certain industries over time in the history of the country, but now feels like it applies to everyone's waking hour, waking breath. And I think that is anxiety-inducing. I think the internet and social media have a lot to do with why that is anxiety-inducing and why we can't turn it off. But we are being confronted with daily reminders that our institutions are crumbling. And I think that there is no institution in the country that historically has enjoyed more favor than higher education because of the fact that it worked. It was successful. You could go to college and you could have a job. And now that is being cast into doubt, these institutions are under threat in a way they've never been before. And we never could have predicted a personality like Donald Trump who would so effectively exploit that anxiety. And that's where we're at now.
Jack, I'd put it like this. I feel like we're living through this moment where the American university is going through a big, scary change. But just because it's scary, that doesn't mean that what comes after will necessarily be worse, but it does mean that it's going to be different. And I think people are starting to accept that.
Yeah, we'll see if they do. Meantime, Andy, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you'd like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Rococo Punch. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Sarah Brown, Carmen Mendoza, Ron Coddington, Joshua Hatch, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening.